Strong Enough merch is now available. Go to strongenoughpod.com and see all the things that you can get to show your strong enough pride, as well as remind people and yourself that you are strong enough and you are worth it. Welcome to the Strong Enough podcast, where we talk about the challenges and celebrate the triumphs of people from all walks of life. I'm your host, Claudia. Today's guest is going to talk about traumas that he experienced as a police officer. He was taught to push them down and ignore his feelings, and he did that until he couldn't any longer. He's going to share what brought him to the point of realizing that he needed to heal, and now he helps others do the same. Please help me welcome Michael Sugrue. Mike, how's it going today?
Good. How about you?
I am doing well, and it's the time of year that it's going to snow again, which makes me very, very happy. How's it looking out in your neck of the woods?
It's sunny and almost 70 degrees right now, so it's beautiful. There's no snow coming, maybe rain in a few days, but it's absolutely beautiful outside right now.
Nice. Well, I am really excited that you decided to join me here for a little bit today. I would love it before we jump in if you would tell the audience a little about yourself.
I'll try to keep this short because sometimes it can be very long. So, in a nutshell, I'm an Air Force veteran. I served 6.5 years active duty. Went in as a butter bar, came out as a captain. I was in security forces, which is basically military police, air-based ground defense, force protection, anti-terrorism, nuclear security, and of course, basic law enforcement. I got out in '04 as a captain, and I went straight into civilian law enforcement, which was my dream, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I'm from originally. And I served a total of 14 years. I was just a regular patrol officer. I was a field training officer, detective, undercover on a state narcotics task force, a patrol sergeant, PIO, and actually medically retired back in 2018 for what I call post-traumatic stress injury, which was a result after a very heinous incident and many others that I was involved in. And so now, through my recovery of post-traumatic stress, I'm trying to give back and share my story. And so I speak across the nation. And I recently co-authored a best-selling book with a psychologist. And that's me in a nutshell.
Well, first off, I do want to say thank you so much for your service. It is much appreciated by those of us that get the benefits of everything that you did, both overseas and here locally. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I want to talk a little bit about trauma and post-traumatic stress because I think a misnomer or a misconception that a lot of people have is that as an officer, you're very hardened and you have those nerves of steel and nothing can affect you. So will you talk a little bit about if that was also your original perception and how it felt then to have kind of trauma and stress sneak up on you?
Yeah, so I used to believe that, and I actually felt that way. I felt like I was invincible. I felt like nothing was ever going to affect me, nothing was ever going to harm me. And the honest truth is that, I mean, I can look back to my first week on training as a civilian police officer, and there was three very traumatic incidents just in that first week alone that to this day I'll literally never forget. And I remember at the time, my training officer and we kind of joked about the calls after we left and before we started documenting them. And that's really where I learned that, we don't talk about feelings. We just suck it up. We pretend like nothing bothers us. And the reality is it could be farther from the truth because as a police officer, but in this case, all first responders, so paramedics, firefighters, dispatchers, we're exposed to literally hundreds and hundreds of traumatic incidents over our career. And these are things like it could be child deaths, really bad car accidents where people are severely injured or die, suicides, homicides, even just natural deaths, domestic violence, you name it. But we literally see like the worst in society and the worst in people. Most people don't call 911 on their best day. They usually call it on their worst day. And so, for years, I did a good job. I literally told myself that I'm never going to bring the job home. I used to be married, and I made a fateful decision that I would never talk about work or the things that were affecting me. And that's honestly one of the biggest mistakes that I ever made. And 8 years into my civilian law enforcement career, after literally hundreds of traumatic incidents that I never talked about, I never processed, they were just really building up and building up. And when I was a brand new patrol sergeant, I was involved in a fatal shooting where a man with a butcher knife was trying to kill a couple and then tried to kill myself and my officers. And in that moment, I literally lost that feeling of invincibility. In that moment, I literally had a fear of dying, one that I never had before. And that incident, and it wasn't just that incident, but that incident brought up a lot of feelings and emotions that were just pent up for years that were never processed, they were never dealt with. And that's unhealthy. And that's literally what led to my demise and led to the demise of my career as a police officer.
A lot of police officers and probably the general public tend to deal with trauma and stress in unhealthy ways. There's drinking, there could be drugs, there could be, different forms of self-sabotage. Did you go through any of that along your journey?
Absolutely. I mean, so for me initially, I noticed that I was drinking way too much. I literally tried to numb myself and try to drink myself to sleep because I was having constant nightmares. And honestly, I was isolating. I didn't want to be around anybody. And if I was around people, I wanted to drink so I didn't have to deal with them or talk with them and just literally be in my own little corner doing my own little thing. So for me, that was really the crux of it. But in my work as a volunteer with the West Coast Post Trauma Retreat, I've seen that other first responders, like you mentioned, they do things like extramarital affairs, gambling addiction, porn addictions, obviously drinking, drug use, whether that's prescription medication or illicit street drugs. But all these things where you're kind of seeking a constant adrenaline rush and you're chasing that excitement. And really, that's unhealthy. I mean, what we need to do is focus on our health, focus on ourselves, and open up and talk about our feelings, not just push them away and hope that they're just going to disappear on their own because they're not. They're not going to go away unless you deal with it.
We tend to bottle up our feelings, and for men, it's even worse. You guys just are taught from the get-go that you're never supposed to cry, you're never supposed to show fear. And then to add the police element on top of that, I mean, you're just really not supposed to have feelings at all. So, how was it when you decided that you were going to deal with the trauma, you were going to address it? How was that kind of coming out of that shell and admitting that you weren't okay?
Well, there was a couple incidents that were out of my control where I didn't want to share my feelings or my emotions, but I literally just broke down. And one of them was at the scene of the shooting that I was involved in, where I had to take, unfortunately, a human life. But a few months after that was my first kind of court proceeding. It was called a coroner's inquest. And in that hearing, my wife was there at the time. It was open to the public. There was reporters, lots of people from my department, the family members of the guy that tried to kill me, his identical twin brother. And when they played the dispatch tapes in that courtroom, I literally started just sweating. I felt like I was going to pass out. And eventually I got called on the stand, and I'm sitting there in front of a full jury, a packed courtroom. And the judge asked me to explain what happened that night. And initially I was doing okay. But when I got to the part where the guy's coming at me with a butcher knife down the stairwell, I lost it. I literally started just bawling like a baby in this packed courtroom. And I was so embarrassed. I was so ashamed. I mean, I couldn't believe it because I'd been in court hundreds of times. And, I didn't show emotion. Like you said, I mean, I was a security forces captain in the Air Force. I was undercover. I was a police sergeant. Like, literally my entire life, I didn't show emotions because as men, that's what we're taught not to do because that's weakness. It's shameful. And that's what I felt at that time. So when the judge excused me, I left that courtroom. And I remember going to the bathroom, just splashing water in my face and just telling myself in the mirror, like, literally, get your shit together. Pull your head out of your ass and get back in that courtroom. And I did. But that literally kind of opened up, that. But something else happened, and I don't want to go into too much detail because a lot of this is my book. But a couple weeks after that hearing, I got called into my supervisor's office, and there was my captain, a couple lieutenants, and I thought for sure they were going to give me praise for the way we handled the incident. We prevailed in that court proceeding. But what happened was they actually questioned the genuineness of my emotions. They actually both said directly and indirectly that I was either acting or putting on a show for the jury. And imagine, like, I'm already ashamed and embarrassed, hoping people are going to forget that that ever happened. And now my quote unquote leadership from my what I thought was my family is now literally questioning my integrity, questioning everything because they didn't believe that my emotions were real, which shows you how bad this issue and problem is, because it's like, yeah, I didn't show emotion, but you saw it. And it's like, I didn't want that to come out. And so when that meeting happened, I made another really bad decision. And I told myself I was going to suck it up. I was going to get through this, never show emotion again. Ended up losing my marriage. I mean, literally, just all kinds of horrible things started happening. And it took another tragic incident where it finally woke me up out of this darkness. But this is 4 years after my shooting, 4 years of suffering in silence, to where I got to the point where I didn't want to be here anymore. I literally wanted to die in the line of duty. I started putting myself in dangerous situations, hoping I got killed at work. That's how bad it got. And it wasn't until my best friend tried to kill himself when I was on duty, that incident is what pulled me out of the darkness. And that's where I finally asked for help.
When I went through the academy, and that was in North Carolina, it was quite a bit longer than a traditional academy. And we learned all kinds of stuff. And we spent weeks at the driving range and weeks at the gun range and weeks in the classroom going through all the statutes and whatnot. And then I did a refresher in Colorado just a few years ago. And we went to the gun range and the driving range. And what we never did was talk about feelings or mental health or wellness. Do you feel like that's changed at all in the last couple years? And if not, what do we need to do? What has to happen to make people more aware as officers and first responders in general that they've got to take care of their mental health?
So first off, I agree with you. I didn't receive any training on that myself, and our academy was over 880 hours. And to further your point, as law enforcement officers, we have literally thousands of hours of training throughout our career. Whether it's defensive tactics, arrest and control techniques, emergency driving, firearms, report writing, evidence collection. I mean, all these things. But what the number one threat to us is isn't the bad person or the bad guy on the street, it's ourselves. Because the greatest risk for law enforcement and all first responders is suicide. It's the number one cause of death, and we don't talk about it. We don't acknowledge it. And those numbers, unfortunately, they're underreported. But last year, we had over 150 reported law enforcement suicides here in the US. And I would say that number is probably 3 to 4 times higher. Since Blue Help started tracking these numbers, we're well over, I believe, 1,200 documented law enforcement suicides. But why don't we spend any time talking about this and training on it? We just want to pretend like it doesn't exist and it's just going to go away. And so things, to answer your other question, are getting a little bit better. But honestly, it depends where you're at, what agency, it depends what part of this country you're in. I travel all across the United States and I speak to different agencies, and some are very progressive. They're putting this at the forefront of their priorities, whether that's officer wellness or officer resilience. They're bringing people in like myself to speak and to talk about these things. They have very good peer support programs. They have outside contracted therapists who are culturally competent, who truly understand us and get it. But the thing is, we have so much more to do because there is still a stigma. And even with some of these resources that agencies have, because I think some agencies, to include mine back when my shooting happened, was hey, we have these great policies and procedures and resources, but nobody uses them. Nobody trusts them because they don't feel like it's confidential. They don't feel like, what they say to these peer support people or these therapists is going to stay between them. They feel like it's going to jeopardize their career. It's going to hurt potential assignments or promotions. They're going to be outcasted to where people don't trust them. They don't want to be associated with them. So we have so much more work to do. I mean, so much more work to do. Things are getting better, yes, but suicide is still here. It's still happening. A few cities away from where I live, just a couple months ago, we had a patrol sergeant that was on duty, went into the locker room and shot himself. And this guy was married. I believe he had like 5 kids. I mean, just done. And this is happening all over the United States. So that's what we need to address. That's what we need to make a priority. We need our leaders to be vulnerable. We need them to step up and share their own personal stories. Put down this facade that we're all perfect. We've got this image of us in uniform and our lives are perfect. We don't make mistakes. No, let's be human. Let's talk about the real people that we are behind the badge and the uniform.
I don't want to really get into a political debate, and I don't really think it would be a debate because I feel like we likely have similar opinions. But let's just say the police have been attacked a lot lately in the last couple years, and there are bad apples. But do you think that the current atmosphere around first responders is more lending to being more open and being that human being and saying, hey, I'm a person too and I'm struggling? Or do you think it's making officers feel more like they have to hide those emotions and stuff down those feelings and that stress and trauma?
I think it's the latter. I think officers feel like they're on an island. Literally, they feel like they don't have support from not just their government. So when I say government, I'm talking federal, state, county, local, all levels. Whether we're talking about mayors, city councils, county commissioners, our most of our chiefs and sheriffs, a lot of them, they're at will employees, and they can be let go at a second. And so, by nature of their position, a lot of them are very political, and a lot of them cater to their bosses, the city manager or the mayor or whatever it may be. And so, as an officer, when you feel like no one's got your back, because we already feel like the community doesn't have our back, and like you said, there's a huge anti-law enforcement movement across this nation. BLM primarily, but there's other aspects that as well. And we're on the street. Everyone's a potential enemy. We don't know who supports us, who's against us. Every single contact that we make is a potential lethal encounter. We could be simply at Starbucks having coffee or lunch, and somebody could come in and want to gun us down, or somebody might want to follow us home to our families and put them in jeopardy. And so this atmosphere has just created this environment where literally officers feel like they have no one to turn to, that there's no one that can support them. And the truth is that we eat our own better than anyone else. And I call this admin betrayal or institutional betrayal. And I talk a lot about this in my book. But this aspect of it, institutional betrayal, is oftentimes what actually pushes officers over the edge to want to commit suicide. It's not the traumatic incident itself, but it's oftentimes when they reach out to their agencies in need at their most dire times and they don't get that support, or they get outcasted, or their agencies turn their backs on them. This is what pushes people over the edge. And I faced that myself in my own journey and my own recovery.
It's interesting that you say that because I faced that as well at my last apartment. And, it made me realize that if these people don't even have my back in this particular situation where everything is truthful and legitimate and they should be supporting me, what is it going to be like in another situation that they're possibly afraid is going to look badly on them? What do we do? What I know we're not going to solve the world's problems here in an hour, but what do you think are some first steps that maybe officers, former officers, and even just the general public can do to help?
Part of it, and I got to tell you, my book is part of the solution, because my book talks about the humanity behind the badge and the uniform. And something that we don't do as law enforcement officers, or as law enforcement agencies for that matter, is we don't show the public the real people that we are. We don't let them in. We don't educate them. We have to inform them and let them know exactly the things that we deal with, things that we see, and why we do certain things, and also inform them of how this affects us. I just read an article actually today, and it was about San Mateo County is a county here in California, and they have a brand new female elected sheriff, and she actually said that officer wellness is key to community relations. Like, we need our officers to be healthy. And I'm not talking about just physically fit, I'm talking about emotionally and mentally fit. And if they are healthy in all those regards, that's going to transcend into the community and how we interact with people and how we serve our communities. And so, not only do we need to take care of ourselves, but we need to bring down the wall and let the public in and let them see who we really are, not just this uncaring, unfeeling person that shows up in uniform, takes charge, and then leaves and just walks away. No, let's let them in. Let's show them the real people that we are. Let's show them the humanity behind the badge, behind the uniform.
I have always said that I felt like every human should have to spend at least 6 months waiting tables to understand kind of what the service industry goes through. So maybe we should add to that, that once they get through with their 6-month, service rotation, that they now do 6 months of ride-alongs, with some different agencies to see what actually does occur day to day, because I think you're right. The image and the portrayal is something different than what most of us are and were going through day to day on the street.
Absolutely. And one good example that I've seen, and they did this here in the San Francisco Bay Area, but they brought a bunch of reporters and community leaders out to one of our big agencies here, and they have a FAT simulator, so a firearm simulator or use of force simulator. And they actually had these civilians who have no law enforcement experience. They had them suit up and have, the mock tools, so a taser, a baton, a firearm, and whatnot, and had them interact in scenarios where there may be a potential lethal threat, or there may not be, but to kind of see how they would react when they have to make split second decisions. And that was so eye opening for the reporters, for the community leaders, because that gave them real insight into, like, hey, here's just one scenario, one example that our officers may face every day, every week. I mean, hundreds of times throughout their career, maybe. And you were just put into it and you panicked and you ended up shooting this guy who was just pulling his ID out of his pocket. And it was like they were in shock. And it's like, yeah, we have to make split second decisions based on what we process or the information that we have at the time. And I think for the most part, we do a pretty damn good job at that. Obviously, better than probably the public would do because we are trained on it. But also remember that when these incidents happen and they're torn apart and picked apart, and we're a Monday, morning quarterback and everything. No, no, let's talk about the facts and what the officers knew at the time of the incident, what they perceived, what they saw, and that's what dictated their actions. Not hindsight, where we have all these hundreds of facts after. We've sent stuff off to the lab, we've analyzed everything, we've interviewed hundreds of people. No, let's look at it at the time of the incident and what the officer knew, how they felt, and what they saw and what they were facing. That's what we need to do, is show them exactly what we do, and the decisions that we have to make. These aren't easy. Nobody wants to take a human life, but we have to do that sometimes. And in my case, it's affected me every day since then, and I know it's going to affect me for the rest of my life. It wasn't just like, oh, this just happened and I went on with my merry way and my life's all good. No, this has affected me every single day since that incident happened. And my incident happened December of 2012.
How does that make you feel to know that it won't ever go away? Because I think a lot of people do have this misconception that you go through trauma and you heal, so I'm better, everything's fine now, and that's just really not the case generally. So, how do you process that, and on a daily basis, how do you work through that uh towards the better?
Well, you hit the nail on the head, but trauma recovery, the longer that you wait to address this issues, the longer it's going to take to recover. And there is no one magic thing that works for everything. What I've found through my own personal journey and my volunteer work, that usually it's a combination of a lot of different things. And in my case, I started my recovery journey back in December of 2016. And I've gone to a therapist, I've seen a psychiatrist. I've been to weekly first responder support meetings. I've been through intensive week long treatment programs like the West Coast Post Trauma Retreat, Save a Warrior. I've done meditation. I've tried medication. I mean, group discussion, all these different things that have got me to where I am today. And I'm night and day. I mean, I'm living a phenomenal life. I'm doing great things. I wake up every day just grateful, living life to the fullest. But I also know that there's certain things that I need to do even after my recovery to maintain that. I have to recognize my triggers when something affects me or something reminds me of a previous incident. There's things like we're always on high alert. We've always got heightened awareness. These are things that may get lessened, but they never go away. I've been retired now for 5 years, but I'm still very high alert. I'm always aware of what's going on around me. I'm always scanning people's waistbands, their hands, deciding whether somebody's a threat or not a threat. And for my recovery today, there's things like I have to go to the gym every single day. I do meditation every day. I still see a therapist, not as much as I used to, but I see a therapist every 2 weeks. I don't go to weekly meetings, but I occasionally go to a meeting like once a month. I go back and volunteer at the West Coast Post Trauma Retreat. I read books on mental health and post traumatic stress. I go to seminars and training events, but this is a continuous journey. And the key is to know how to address it when these feelings come up. And the biggest, honest, easiest thing to do, I mean, it's easy now saying this, is just talking about it, is normalizing it. Because when you keep this stuff inside, that's what builds up and often leads to disaster. And so I've learned that, hey, if something's bothering me, I'm going to call or meet up with somebody that I trust, and I'm going to get this off my chest. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to share it, and I'm going to feel better after that. And it could be as simple as that, is finding people that you trust, that you can confide in and talk about these issues.
I'm so glad that you added in those couple words. It's something that I talked about with a recent guest in being vulnerable and being able to share how you're feeling and what you're going through. And those key words were someone that you trust. Because if you don't find that right person that you trust, you're not really in a safe space. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that and the importance of not just talking about it, but talking about it with the right person for you.
Yeah, trust is critical. I mean, if you don't have trust, no one's going to open up. No one's going to be vulnerable. No one's going to share. When you ask them how they're doing, they're going to say, I'm doing fine. And they're going to press on. Even though they're falling apart inside, yes, you have to have trust. And so, yeah, we talk about trust in our personal lives, which could be a spouse, it could be a partner, it could be a relative, it could be a priest, a therapist, clinician. But we also need to have people that we can trust within our own agencies. And you mentioned it again, is vulnerability. Is how can we expect our people to open up if their supervisors, if their leaders aren't vulnerable first? And that was one of the first things I learned, was that when I met my first therapist, my culturally competent therapist, is on day one, she opened up and shared with me a very dark, deep personal story of her life. And when she told me that, and I saw that she was living proof that you can get better, I immediately knew that I could trust her with my life. I could tell her anything because of the fact that she was open and honest and vulnerable with me first.
So, PTSD is kind of the catchphrase recently, it seems. And I get very frustrated a lot of times when I hear people talking about it. What I mean by that is, you'll hear somebody say, "Oh, I have PTSD from waiting in line at the grocery store. It was just the worst thing ever." And I kind of want to punch them. Do you run into that as well, where you feel like it's just something that's being overused and thus people don't really understand the severity and the consequences of true post traumatic stress disorder or injury?
To your point, I think it's definitely being overused. We see it on the news probably on a nightly basis. It's kind of a catchphrase now, and I don't even like post traumatic stress disorder. I use post traumatic stress injury. We can talk about that in a few, but what I've also learned though through my work and my recovery is that a lot of people have personal trauma, and that could be oftentimes all the way back to childhood. And so I think that honestly, most people do understand trauma. I think that most people have had something they've been exposed to, something they've experienced. I mean, nothing on the level of a first responder because our jobs are very unique and we're exposed to hundreds of traumatic incidents, whereas a normal person may have one or two traumatic incidents in their lifetime. And I'm not downplaying that. I'm not saying that's any less severe than ours, but I think to the core, I think most people do understand trauma. But I do think that that phrase is overused. And I think we have to be very careful on when we actually use that. But again, it comes down to personal choice. What may affect you may not affect me, and vice versa. I can take my shooting for example, and there was four of us that were involved in that shooting, but we are all affected in a different way. And two retired, two are still working. And I know that three of them were definitely affected. The fourth, I don't know. He never talks about it. He never really acknowledges it. He's just gone on with his life. So maybe it didn't affect him. I don't know. But so I don't want to take away the value of, when somebody says that they've experienced trauma, we really need to listen to that and we need to hear it because, again, we're all different. Things affect us in different ways. And I think we just need to be open to having these honest, frank discussions.
Do you ever worry about that fourth person that maybe he or she is like you used to be and is just stuffing it down and hasn't really dealt with it yet?
I do. I actually know that there's countless law enforcement officers that are doing that. I mean, right now as we're speaking. And oftentimes these people come across as assholes, to be blunt. They come across as not caring, as hard asses, people that are unapproachable, people you don't want to talk to. How do I know that? Because I was one of them. At the height of my struggling, that's who I was. And I put that up as a front to make people think that nothing bothered me. And I didn't want people to talk to me about it. I want them to approach me about it. And I think that, when I hear stories about administrators or, people in their own agencies that are having issues, that's what comes to mind is that these people haven't dealt with it themselves. And unfortunately, most police officers, they don't realize how messed up they are until they retire. Because when we're operational and we're on the job, we're all good. We can go out there every single day, we can perform, we can take care of business. But when we leave the job, whether that's retirement or we're off on injury, if that's physical injury or mental injury, and we have all that downtime now, we start thinking about all the things that we've seen, all the things that we've dealt with, that's when it comes up. That's when it rears its ugly head. When we've lost that identity where all we knew or are known as is a police officer. And so in my volunteer work, I often see a lot of times officers that are 1 or 2 years after retirement that are truly just messed up. I mean, their lives are falling apart and they're desperate. And they come through these programs to finally get help because they're finally acknowledging, what's been hidden all this time.
So let's talk a little bit about post traumatic stress injury and what led you to use that terminology and make that designation as opposed to PTSD.
Well, first off, the word disorder has a very negative connotation. I mean, nobody wants to have a disorder. It makes you think like it's just something you're stuck with. You can't get better. You have no control over it. And the reality is that, and this has been proven with countless, medical imaging, diagnosis, where they can do MRIs of the brain. They can actually see when the human brain is affected by trauma. And when a person is exposed to trauma, especially repeated trauma, there are chemical changes to the brain, and there's also, physical changes to the brain. And that's a proven fact. And it's also proven that when you go through recovery and you try different forms like EMDR stellate ganglion block, which is a medical procedure that I've had done. We talk about it in the book, and you can have further changes in the human brain. So, we acknowledge that officers have back injuries and shoulder injuries and knee injuries. And what do? We go see a doctor, we get diagnosed. Maybe they give us some cortisone injections, some pain medication, physical therapy. Maybe we have surgery. I mean, there's steps that we can take to get better and to overcome this injury. Well, post traumatic stress is no different. It's a injury to the brain, and there's things that we can do to help heal that injury. And so by just changing that one word from disorder to injury, it lets people know that there's hope. So the simple term disorder versus injury, that shows people that you can get better, that there's things that you can do to overcome this physical injury of your brain. Whereas disorder, there's no hope. I mean, it's literally like, what am I going to have to be medicated for the rest of my life and just deal with this? I'm never going to get better. My life's never going to change. No, that could be the farthest from the truth. There's things that you have to do. Like I said, no different than a shoulder injury or back injury. There's things that you have to do to get better, but you can. That's the key difference.
Was writing your book part of your healing journey, or was that more to help others, or a combination?
It's first of all, it's not anything I ever planned or envisioned. I kind of have to give you a quick kind of story behind this because it's a really cool story. So I've always been kind of on social media, and I had a pretty big presence on LinkedIn. And Dr. Shauna Springer, she's a clinical psychologist. She's a Harvard graduate. She had written 3 books, and she'd worked mostly with combat veterans in the military through the VA and TAPS, which is the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors and First Responders. And so she reached out to me. This is before COVID. And she just wanted to introduce herself, tell me about the work that she was doing with stellate ganglion block, which is a medical procedure to treat the physical symptoms of post traumatic stress. And so we set up a phone call, and she was talking about what she does. And she asked me, she's like, "Hey, what do you do? What's your story?" And so I told her my very deep, dark, just personal story that's in the book and more. And she asked me, she was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I said, "Well, it's funny you asked that because I've thought about it, but honestly, with post traumatic stress, I don't feel like I have the focus, the drive, the energy, or the determination to even get something like that done." So we kind of just left the conversation at that. A couple months later, she hits me back up and she said, "Look, your story is just really sticking with me." She's like, "I've heard hundreds and hundreds of trauma stories, but your story is going to help countless people. It's going to literally save lives." And she said, "I want to make this book a reality. I want to do this book with you." And I literally, at that very moment, I said, "Let's do this." I didn't even hesitate. Like, I knew that she was the right one to partner with on this. And so COVID happens, and we didn't even actually meet in person until a year and a half after we started this project. We literally met on Zoom like every week for 2 hours and would call each other and go back and forth with the editing and whatnot. And so it's just a real unique process. But what makes this book so unique is that this isn't just a story or a bunch of stories. I talk about my life all the way from childhood until now, present day, and I go very, very deep, very personal. I talk about the mistakes that I made, the lessons learned. But the second half of every chapter, Dr. Springer breaks it down in a very simple terms, in layman terms, so that anybody reading this book, whether you're a first responder, a family member of one, or just a random person on the street, you're truly going to understand the effects of the job on us, on our families, on our physical health, our mental health. You're going to see the true human behind the badge. And that's what makes this book so unique. I don't know anything else out there that's like this, that has this format. And it came out in April 2022, so it hasn't even been out a year. And it was a bestseller for 20 straight weeks. It's literally sold thousands and thousands of copies in 6 different countries, and it's saving lives. I mean, I'm literally getting messages almost daily, people talking about how it saved their marriage, it saved their career, but more importantly, it's saving lives. And that's why we did this book. That's why we took on this project.
Are there additional books in the future?
I know Dr. Springer, I believe, is working on some books. I myself I don't think so. I mean, things can always change. Like I said, I never envisioned this one. But right now, there's no other books in the work.
All right, so
But
we got to get
but
this one.
but a movie deal. Now we're
Okay.
talking. So
Okay.
I'm thinking if the directors of Training Day or End of Watch happen to be listening to this or watching this, make sure you read Relentless Courage because I truly think someday it's going to be a movie.
I will give this little teaser. I have an end of watch story to tell you when we're done. So
Got
I
it.
will
All
I will
right.
let
Well,
you know something on that.
it's my favorite movie, so I've seen it over 37 times. I mean,
Oh my
it's just
gosh.
I actually burnt out the Blu-ray and I had to go get another Blu-ray. That's how many times I've seen it. So yeah, it's one of my favorite movies. And Training Day is number three. So both those movies are solid, and yeah. So I'm hoping one day maybe this can be turned into a film like that.
Okay, you said Training Day was number 3, so now we have to know what number 2 is.
See, now you're putting me on the spot. That's a tough one, but number two I would say is Brooklyn's Finest with Richard Gere
Okay.
and a bunch of other great actors. So I know you're seeing a theme here. There's a lot of cop
Mhm.
movies, but there's some war movies mixed in as well, like Platoon. So it's all cop and war movies basically.
I mean, you can't hate on that. Well, we have talked about some kind of tough stuff, and we're going to take a quick turn before I let you go. We're going to talk about something physically painful, but way more fun, and that's tattoos. So I have a lot of tattoos. You can't see any of them today because I am in a hoodie, courtesy of Revolt Tattoos, and I refuse to get a tattoo on my face or neck. But I love tattoos, and I think they tell a story, and I just they're amazing. Now I know that you have a tattoo that has kind of a good story behind it, and I would love if you would share that with us.
Yeah, so I've never shared this on any interview, and it's not a proud moment, but I'm going to share it here, and I'm going to be vulnerable. It's part of my healing process to get over this because I'm still scarred by this event. So I'm going to take you back to Texas, and it was 1999, and I just finished my United States Air Force Security Forces training. So this isn't like boot camp. This is our advanced training where we get the beret, we get the badge, and we actually become cops in the United States Air Force. And I was in training with other officers, so it was all lieutenants and a couple of captains. And when we finished, we made a plan that we were going to go to Austin, Texas. We were going to celebrate, and we're going to get shit faced, and we were all going to get tattoos. And so, me being the leader that I am, I decided that I would go first. And so we found, we went to a bunch of little tattoo spots there in downtown Austin, and I found what I thought was the best one at the time. Of course, just flipping through these little binders with tattoo images. And of course, this is 99. So I want you guys to keep this in mind. Like Baywatch is a popular movie, and I think Pamela Anderson had the barbed wire, like tribal, and so I got a tribal tattoo on my right arm. And fortunately, you can't see it when I'm wearing a t-shirt. It's a little high up. And yeah, and so I got that done, left the tattoo parlor, and I'm like, all right, guys, who's going next? And lo and behold, nobody else got a tattoo. I was the only one. So, and
That's
to
just
this
wrong.
day, it is wrong. And honestly, to this day, it's one of my biggest regrets because it's completely meaningless. Like there's nothing behind it. And I've actually thought about one of two things. The first thing is just get it removed, get it lasered, be done with it. And part of me also thought about getting a sleeve, but with meaning and incorporating aspects of my security forces career, my law enforcement career, my shooting. And so I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, but I kind of go back and forth on that. I know getting rid of it is probably going to be easier. And I'm so damn picky when it comes to tattoos that and the design. And I did for a while actually go visit like 7 different tattoo shops and talk to people. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Well, you came to the right place because I know somebody that works with people who want to get rid of their tattoos. It's terribly painful and it takes a really, really long time. But if your tattoo is solid black, that is a good thing. That's one of the easiest colors to remove. But I also know some really great artists and one who happens to be in your area. So we'll also talk about that. Mike, where can
Awesome.
people find you? So if they want to grab the book, if they just want to check in and see what's going on with you, or if they want to go out and have some coffee and maybe catch the 70-degree sunny weather where you're at, where can they find you?
So the book is only on Amazon. It's called Relentless Courage: Winning the Battle Against Frontline Trauma. You can get it on Kindle through Amazon, or there's paperback or hardcover. As far as getting a hold of me, I'm literally on, well, I'm not on TikTok, but I'm on pretty much every other platform besides that. So I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, Parlor, even Truth, which I think I'm only like one of 10 people on that platform, LinkedIn, and I check my messages daily. So definitely feel free to reach out on the Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all the other platforms. Just look for Sergeant Michael Sugrue. If you type that in, you'll get linked right to my sites. But I also run First Responders First, and there's a Facebook page, an Instagram page, and I also host a private group, which is only for first responders, military, or their loved ones or family members. And so I highly encourage you to join that group, and you can post things and share things as long as it pertains to, wellness or anything to do with, first responders or military members.
Awesome. And we will get all those links on the screen and in the notes so that people know where to find that. Mike, you have been amazing. I truly appreciate your time today. And I'm so grateful that you were willing to share what you've been through and that now you are working to help others.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media so you'll never miss what's going on. Remember, until next week, you are strong enough, you are worth it. Thank you for listening to the Strong Enough podcast. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform by searching Strong Enough. And on YouTube, we're on the Spear Talk channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Strong Enough Pod. If you have suggestions for an upcoming episode or a future guest, please reach out at strongenoughpod@gmail.com. Remember, you are worth it.